Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you are in. My name is Stephen Portnoy. I'm with Professional Services here at Servoy. And with me, as always, is Sean Devlin. Good morning, Sean.
Party on, Steve.
Party on, Sean.
Party on.
Today, Sean has put together a demonstration of audit logging. Audit logging is one of those things that sort of falls by the wayside, like commenting your code and documenting your solutions. But it is one of those things that really separates a good solution from a great solution. And we're looking forward to learning more about it today. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Sean, although I will say one thing. If you do have questions, please enter them in the questions panel, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the webinar. All yours, Sean.
Okay, thanks, Steve. My screen is visible?
It is.
Okay, and I'm guessing you can hear me because you're responding to me.
You sound perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So here we go again, number 38 on the bi-weekly series. We are doing one of those non-functional topics that is just one small part of a big platform, and we try to get all these little topics in over the course of a year and record them so we have kind of a video archive of documentation. If you missed any of the prior webinars and you see the list up here, and if any of them look interesting to you, you can always go check them out on the recorded version. As is the tradition, we will start by showing you something, and then we'll sort of do the overview with some slides. We won't bore you to death with a bunch of slides. Today we're doing audit logging, which is essentially logging everything that a user might do to a table. We'll give you an example of how to set it up, and then also once the log data is generated, how does one sort of interact with that log data, and then we'll discuss some of the best practices. So I'm going to switch on over to an application that I've set up quickly here, and I'm going to log in. The reason I have a login screen is because audit logging is tied to security and tied to the user that's logged in, so it makes sense that we have a current user when we do audit logging. One of the things we might want to do when we are audit logging is see what a user has done to a particular record. So in this case, I just put a little related table down below. We're looking at a customer record, and we might want to see the audit history just for that record, so you could see most recently the user and what they've done to this record. So that's the kind of outcome you get. I'm going to show you a few more examples, but I want to dive right under the hood into the IDE and show you how to set it up, and then we'll look at a few more examples. So the first thing that you need to do when you set up audit logging is just a couple of minutes to really set it up. One is you want to identify a database that's going to serve as your log server. Now this can be any of the databases that you connect to. Quite often people create a separate database to hold their log data. That's up to you. You can also put it in with all your other tables as well. So I've created a separate database called log server, and when you look at the settings for the database connection, one of the properties is this Boolean property here, log server, where when you check it, that now directs all the audit logging to this server, and it's going to look for a table called log that has the right schema. Now, the first time you set this up, when you enable log server, the create log table and create client statistics table buttons will become enabled. And so you can just create the log table and it will generate that table for you. If we open up the log table here, you can see that it sets up a few columns to capture the log information. Essentially what we want to capture is what the user did and when to which table, and actually specifically the primary key data is captured so we know which record was affected. We know the log type or the log action type, so if they inserted, updated, deleted. And also we have a before and after image for every column that was modified. So it's pretty granular, the amount of data that's captured. So really you take those two steps and then you have a log table and you can begin audit logging. However, you won't automatically start populating this table. You have to set up which tables and in fact which user groups get audited as part of security settings before you really see the auditing. So that would be the next step that you take. So if we look at a particular entity, I'm going to bring up the customers table since we were just looking at that. You'll notice one of the tabs in the table settings is called security. Now, one of the things you do in security is set up whether or not a user can, insert, update, delete type of thing. But another setting that you might enable is tracking. And so you can enable tracking on insert, update, deletes and also on selects, and we'll get to the selects in a minute. But for now, I've enabled insert, update, delete for the group administrators. Now, in this particular example, I'm also using the Servoy security extension, which we cover in pretty good detail in another webinar. But suffice to say for this example that when we call login, we're also passing in the groups, the security permissions that are associated with the user, and that from there, the Servoy security and audit engine takes care of everything for you. So now that we've enabled tracking for this particular group, for this particular table, we'd be able to see the log entries getting filled in. So let's go back to the running solution and just sort of see it in action. Maybe I'll go to, say, a different entity here. This one has a little bit of log history already. So if I'm gonna change one of these cities, let's maybe do Boston, and we'll do USA. And at the moment where I save, you can see that that 2 new entries came in here in the audit history because we're capturing every value that was changed. So we actually write 2 records for the city and the country that was changed. Now I had to do a couple of other things to get that to show up here. So let's take a look at that. Because this is just a plain old database table, I was actually able to make a relation to it. So I have a relation here called customers to log, and this is really just between the customers table and that log table that was generated. Now there's the PK data is captured, and it's captured in kind of a funny format because we allow for, of course, composite keys where multiple columns make up the key. So it's really a delimited string of values, and customer happens to have a single primary key, so it's just one value. But I did make a calculation in the customers table in order to get the format right. I'll show you what it looks like in my database admin tool. You can see this column right here with PK data. It actually is the number of characters, then a dot, and then the characters of the primary key, and then it's separated by a semicolon for if it's a composite key. So you just have to know that if you're working with composite keys, you have to sort of machinate it a bit to get it to represent what you want. In my case, I made a simple calculation called log PK, and you can see that it just sort of concatenates that length with that customer ID, which is the primary key, with a semicolon. So that's one way to do it. And then, of course, in Servoy, you can make relations that are based on calculations on the left-hand table. So I just plug that in, and away we go. So that on the form, the customer edit form, when we place a grid on that form, you can see that the found set for the grid uses the relation customers to log. And just by simply doing that, I get the audit log to show up. Now, one thing that I would point out is that audit logging really can be updating that table or inserting to that table quite a lot. So for that reason, we don't do a typical data broadcast on that table because that would introduce some performance overhead. So what I did is you'll notice that when I save the record, I'll just put this back, say, to UK and save it. At that moment, I'm calling the refresh in the audit history here to force it to reload. It doesn't automatically broadcast in there, and you wouldn't want it to because it would introduce performance overhead. Let's take a look at just sort of the the audit table by itself, I've created another view over here where you can see pretty much all of the fields that are in that table, and you can get a sense of how one might analyze this data. Now, some people just audit everything and they sit on it just to have as an archive for someday when they have to go back and reconstruct something that happened. But other folks might want to actually make it part of their application. Like I just showed you, you can show the audit history of an individual entity. This is looking at everything in that table, and we could do some sort of filtering, like, what is this particular user doing in, say, the past day? And you can see that it's filtered down there. Maybe I want to do it only by deletes. So I can see what tables, actions have been a delete, and I could even do it by table. So I could have a look at, say, the orders table. So because it's a simple database table, you can chop it up any way you want. A final example of that might be to also summarize it. So here I created a couple of charts, and you can see that we have the count of the number of edits based on table and also based on what the user did. So we can say, hey, this guy here is working really hard, let's give him a raise. Just kidding. And that we just do by querying directly to the database and putting a data set into those charts. I want to go back to the IDE here and show you how to enable the read audit, which I had disabled, but I'm going to open up the products table, and under security for this group, you can see that we've turned on tracking for insert, update, delete. Now for this example, I also want to turn on tracking on select. So now it will actually write an audit log when the user accesses a record. So when they see a record, it's going to audit not only that they saw that record and when, but also what were the values when they read it, so that later, if they changed over time, you could still reconstruct that record and know what they had seen. I'm going to turn this on, but I should point out that this creates really a lot of data. You can imagine that even if you see a grid of records, then it writes a bunch of data for that. So I would recommend that you use this with care, and you'll see how much more data we get. So I'm going to save that. I'm also going to kind of re-log into my application, and maybe I'll use a different user so that it stands out a bit here. I'll come in as, say, Juan, and log in. And so now when I go to my products table, it's actually going to generate a bunch of those log records just by the fact that I landed on that form. So there I've read some records. I didn't even go to the detail. And if we go to our log here, you can see that, on June 6th at 11:14 a.m., all of these reads were audited. So it's basically a fire hose of data. If I were to filter that out and say we only wanted updates, you would see it go away. We wouldn't have as much, so we could easily mask that so it doesn't pollute our view of, say, what's been done to a record. This is only what's been accessed in that record. The same is true if we look at the summary here. Now you can see that there were 1,025 audit records created for that simple view of that record. So now this doesn't happen every time you land on the form because it has to do also with caching. So those records are cached, and we know when they've changed and when the user has seen them. So it's not like every time I visit the form it's going to generate another 1,000 records, but it is a lot of data. So you want to use that with care. So that's pretty much a simple example here. There's not much to do to set it up. And once you have it set up, you can kind of chop it up any way you want. Let's go back to the presentation, and we'll just kind of go over some of what we saw and also some of the best practices. So we really see the use cases for this, particular in financial and healthcare applications. And the read audit that you saw we actually introduced that into the product because we had several healthcare applications where the developers were requesting to have this feature to be HIPAA compliant. So In the US, we have healthcare privacy laws that require people that store healthcare data to audit who has seen particular, like, patient records, for example. One thing that you can also do that's because you have the before and after images, you can restore the state of a record at a granular level. So if you have some support crisis and one of your users has gone and messed up all of their data, it is possible to, on a granular level, fix individual records. Although you may take nightly snapshots of the database or something, in that case it would be hard to restore the snapshot, but then also keep all the changes they made in the meantime or something. So this can be nice to say, hey, well, we know what happened and we can revert it because we have the full audit trail before and after image. So the steps we took is really simple. First, we identify the log server. That can be any of your databases. And then from there, we create the log table inside that server, and that generates this one table. And then we set up tracking with the granular security settings. And remember, that's for every table. You can set that up differently, also for every table, for every group. So you could say that certain security groups only are audited, that kind of thing. You could have a particular security group called audit that you assign to certain users, and then they are the ones that are audited. It's linked to internal security, which is a complicated topic in and of itself, and that's covered in other webinars. So we have that on the recorded archives. So I recommend you go back and watch that if you need to. It captures essentially who did what, when, including the before and after images. And once you've captured the audit records, it's pretty easy to analyze. And in our example, we saw the user chopping it up by date and user and table. This is a bit of the code. I didn't show you the code, but in that case, I was just doing simple found set filter params. So with the tokenized string for the list of users or actions, we simply added a filter param for that and reloaded the records. For the chart example, that was done because that's summarized data. We were actually summarizing the number of edits per user or per table. That was done through the query builder, and that's just a few lines of code here, and you can see that we get a data set which is essentially providing the number of edits per user in this case, and then we pass that into the chart and it re-renders. So some of the best practices, you will generate a lot of data with audit logging. So of course you want to maintain proper indexing so that when you go and you query that data, you don't want very slow results. It will grow over time, so it might be necessary to archive it. Say you only keep 30 days worth of audit in your database, and everything else you put into a separate archive, so that if you have reads to that database, it stays quick. The read audit, which is a separate option, you really want to limit that to scenarios where you really need that data, because it does generate so much so quickly that you don't want to do that unless it's necessary. And if you do that, steps 1 and 2 become even more important. Finally, it's quite common that people will use a standalone database just for their log server because it can fill up quickly, so you don't want that to drag on resources of other tables that you query and update often. So that's a pretty common best practice as well. We're going to take some questions now. I see some questions coming in, and I'll leave up these useful links, hopefully so you can digest them while we answer some questions. Steve, what do we have?
So we have a couple questions. The first question is, how do you easily analyze the data when the field changed is an ID? And I think I know what she's talking about. This is from Quail. If, for instance, if you're storing countries in a separate table so that you can generate a value list, but then the data that's actually stored in a country column for a customer is a primary key, or a foreign key in this case, what's a good way to be able to analyze the log data if all you're seeing are IDs for values changed?
Right, so it would be a foreign key that's being changed, so you wouldn't see very easily. In that case, you have to make relations or value lists on those there's those two columns, the old value and the new value, which will just be probably integers, right?
Sure. Well, that's what I thought too, but except you may be changing data for lots of different tables, lots of different foreign tables. One thing I thought of is maybe you add a button on the table view that you can click that would just say translate keys, so that it could then at that point for that record read what table is it talking about and then do a query to find the actual text values for the keys that are being changed.
Well, I mean, it is just a plain database table, so you can use it in many different ways at the same time. So if you're looking at the audit trail of an individual, table, say it's a country code and it's orders. And if you're looking at just the audit for the orders, you can customize that view and just have a data provider on there that uses a value list, for example, for even though it's on the field old value, new value, it would use your country's value list, for example. Now that obviously wouldn't apply if you were looking at a mix of other entities at the same time, because then it would make no sense. Or even for that entity, if the changed column was something other than country code, right? So you would have a mix even within the same table. So you have another column called column name. So you can capture the column name as well. It is captured. And so you kind of have to maybe make a calculation or something that looks at, if you're looking at a mix of records that says, oh, well, if the column name is country code, then, the displayed value should be this related value, order to country, something like that. Or not order, but order audit to country, something like that. But yeah, I mean, if you're analyzing lots of tables, then you may generate a lot of these extra artifacts just to view it. But it's just data, and Servoy is really good at chopping that stuff up and displaying it the way you want. So there's lots of ways to do it. Indeed.
And another question from Juan Antonio is, good afternoon, can that table be filtered by tenant?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. We don't, for this particular table, we don't inject any extra info in that gets captured, and there is no, it bypasses any triggers or anything because of performance. If you're inserting a bunch of records quickly, we don't run the table events. So it's not filtered by tenant by default. What we do capture is the user ID, which will be enough except for setups where the user ID is not unique in tenant. So if the user ID is unique in the tenant, then it's not going to help at all to have that. But if it is unique in the tenant, then the user ID should be enough because you can relate from the user to the tenant.
Okay. What about adding a field and setting a default value coming from a global variable?
Yeah, that might be possible. I'll have to look into that offline. I think some of the typical things that you can do to a table are bypassed because the record is not generated in a found set and it doesn't go through the normal like events, like on record insert or before record insert, that sort of thing. Auto enter might work because that's really just a default value and not related to the found set. So I'll look into that, Juan Antonio.
There you go. I think that does it for the questions. Do you want to give us a preview of what our next webinar will be?
Yeah, well, it's the same as the last next webinar, which we had to delay, which is announcing some new stuff on the grid components front. We're getting that ready. It will probably coincide with Servoy 8.3.1. We need to make some changes to the platform to really take advantage of some of the grid components that we have to offer. So we're going to push that out a bit, hopefully by the next webinar to make an announcement there. If not, we have more of these sort of non-functional topical ones, kind of in our backlog, and we'll probably be doing one of those if we're not quite ready.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you all for attending, and we will see you in 2 weeks.